So Herr records this. And so what you need to know at this point is what some of these images look like. So this, I'm going to just get my head out of the way here. This is the Black Panther logo, one of them. There's another one. This is the Black Power sign. The Black Panther logo, as it was put onto jackets and things like that, looked like this. And it's very rare to find these. You can find these in images, pictures, but they're hard to find. Mostly because this was never really, this was not organized. This was not a corporation. It didn't become a corporate structure. Basically, it was it was, the movement was organized. But so this Black Power, which is the fist of basically resistance, is going to be incredibly important in the next little moment. And the Black Power movement is incredibly important when it shows up here. And this is a very famous picture where John Carlos on the right and Tommy Smith in the center at the Olympics raise their fists in the Black Power salute on the podium. And this was one of those sort of astonishing images that went around the world, and it is just as important and forceful as any of the images I showed you that officially come from the Vietnam War. I would say that this is part of the Vietnam War. It certainly is part of the language of resistance, I suppose. Okay, so keep this in mind as we. Let me just move back to the. Keep this in mind, this particular image in mind, as we look at the next piece from Herr on page 180 to 181. He was really big. I've been here more than 8 months now, he said. I bet I've been more 20 firefights. I ain't hardly fired back once. So here's one of the things that soldiers began to do, which was they were given weapons and they deliberately fired over the heads of the enemy. They didn't, or they in one way or another chose not to fight. How come, says Herr. Shit, I go firing back, I might kill one of the brothers, you dig it? I nodded. Noah Viet Cong called me honky, and he told me that in his company alone there were more than a dozen Black Panthers, and that he was one of them. Well, okay, you just don't know. I mean, it's a very dangerous thing to confess this, especially to a white man, which Herr is, right? And he's obviously sympathetic, and he comes to be trusted by the group. But at the same time, he moves around, so he doesn't stay with one group of people for the whole time. He moves around the country, so he's having to get in with people and have them learn to trust him each time that he moves. So. I didn't say anything, he says. And then he said, he wasn't just a Panther, he was an agent for the Panthers, sent over here to recruit. So at this point, you can say, well, it does make sense that if you're going to recruit militant participants of the Black Panther movement, which believes in violence, or at least doesn't disavow it. I mean, the thing about King and his movement was that he said, we will never use violence. That is never something you will catch us doing. We will always be into peaceful resistance, which means marching, sit-ins, be-ins, and so on. But we will not fight. You will not catch us fighting back. And that is how people were trained. And people had to take training into, as to how to not fight and to go limp when they would get sit-ins, and then there's a whole training process that you had to learn, and then you were allowed to go basically and protest if you'd been trained properly, and you've been trained not to get up and fight with people and so on. Well, if the Panthers are looking for militant young men, why wouldn't they send people to Vietnam and say, while you're over there, convert people to our cause, and when they come back, they'll have military training, and they'll have been enraged by what they see and will recruit them, or they'll already be recruited. So he was an agent for the Panthers, sent over here to recruit. I asked him what kind of luck he'd been having, and he said, fine, real fine. There was a fierce wind blowing across the LZ, so remember, these are landing zones, and Herr is waiting to be picked up by a helicopter. And the joint didn't last very long because they're smoking. Hey, baby, he said, that was just some shit I told you. Shit, I ain't no Panther. I was just fucking with you. See what you said. But the Panthers have guys over here. I've met some, says Herr. That could be, he said, and he laughed. And as the chopper rose from the strip, he leaned out and laughed, bringing up his arm and bending it back toward him, palm out and fist clenched tightly in the sign, capital S-I-N-I-G-N, right? So this is on page 180. So what's he doing? Is he just sort of screwing with Whitey? Well, maybe. The danger presented to the black soldiers, and ultimately by their banding together, was the threat that they presented to the white military power structure. It was a substantial danger that they presented. And this is why I've had us look at Rawls' A Black GI in the Santoli reading, where he talks about the soul kitchen, where the men stay. And this is a particularly illuminating little moment, because it's clear that, especially after King's death, white soldiers who were sent out basically to, get people in line, like the military police, did not want to get into a fight with black soldiers. It was very tricky. And so you get this group in Saigon where black soldiers could band together. And so here's a little discussion, which I'm going to add, which is from the documentary called Bloods of Nam, about Martin Luther King and about black hooches and about Confederate flags, from Wallace Terry's documentary that they made based on his book, Bloods. Okay, so let's have a look at that.
Problems.
I understand that during Vietnam War, Martin Luther King died. I want to know, did that bring up a lot of racial issues?
I happen to live in an all-black hut. It was the first all-black hut in Vietnam. And there were 8 of us in the hut. And it was interesting that even before we knew that he had been killed, all of a sudden these Confederate flags started flying over a lot of the Quonset huts and some of the major facilities. And we kind of tried to figure out where our head was at. Like, what do we do now? Do we take these folks on? Because we went to a couple of the huts and asked them to take the flags down, because we knew what it symbolized. They weren't up the day before, they were up that day. But I think it really hit us when over one of the warehouses, they had to be about 8 by 10 foot flag, Confederate flag, flying over the American flag. We went to the CO of the base and said, look, if you don't get these flags down, there's going to be a problem, a very serious problem. Within 15 minutes, all the flags were down. Yes, there were some problems.
In the months that followed King's death, black militancy swept across the rear areas. Bloods like Randolph Dobie organized themselves, raised their fists in black power salutes, studied black history, wore black beads and berets, and even chose to live in all black hooches.
Well, they had all white hooches, and they did that primarily for commonality of interest. There was no assignment of hooches. Basically, the whites or any group of Marines could elect to stay in a certain hut. Then we went to the CO and asked if we could have our hut, so that we could have a hut of common interests and goals and relationships. And the CO granted us that privilege.
Now, how did your fellow white Marines feel about this all-black hooch in their midst?
Well, at first they didn't seem to have any problems, but later on there were a couple of incidences of cross burnings, and they even tried to burn down the hut once.
What do you mean cross burnings? Did you see a cross burned in Vietnam?
Yeah.
Where?
In front of my hut.
What did you do when you saw a Confederate flag flying over a forward base?
The damn thing came down. And the commander answered to me.
Why did you bring it down?
Because we weren't fighting the Civil War. And there's no such thing as northern blood or southern blood. There can be no such thing as black blood and white blood when you're being fired at. And the interesting thing is, I never saw that happen in forward areas. It was only when you got to the relative security of the main base on the perimeter that you saw that happen.
There was a amount of prejudice in Vietnam, but when you got out in the jungle, there was no room for prejudice, because you would want your enemy to see that other silhouette that's standing beside you, regardless of his color, because he got more targets to shoot at. So this is what taught me that this is just a tradition that would just pass down to us, to be prejudiced, to look upon people differently. Because when your life is at stake, it doesn't make any difference that the man to the left or the right of you is black, yellow, red, orange. It makes no difference, as long as he performs his duty and protects your back. Now, this is what caused me to throw away, to sit down and reanalyze a lot of concepts that I had, thoughts that I had, you know, especially when I was in Vietnam. I got, you know, very militant, black power, brother, and everything. But when I thought over my experience, I came to the conclusion I would be worse than the perpetrators who are inflicting discrimination against me if I try to reverse discrimination, because I know better. I know how it feels to be discriminated against.
Okay. What is important to remember is that the power that these African-American individuals had was limited, such that when the soldiers came home and the 70s began to move ahead, black power waned and the great struggles for civil rights passed. Well, what happened to those who returned? And this is sort of like what became of the Black Revolutionary Movement, in the same way that, what became of the Equal Rights Amendment, the drive by second wave feminists to have women identified in the Constitution by a constitutional amendment as equal in the eyes of the law, which would have been enormously powerful. And it was something which was very much, I think it would have been a very, very fine thing to have happen. It was a very sad day when the ERA was defeated. Not a surprise, particularly, because remember, it's men who are in charge. Okay, so now we will move on to point 5.